On this day, 100 years ago, one of the bloodiest conflicts in history ended. Our history books tell us of battles, of officers, of numbers dead and wounded. But more often than not, they tell us very little of the enlisted soldier, the farmer or fisherman or laborer, the store clerk or the bank clerk. War memorials list the names of those who died and in some cases those who served. Hundreds of names. If we walk the cemeteries of our communities, we find the gravestones of World War I veterans that give a name, perhaps a battalion, a date of birth, and a date of death. But after 100 years, our knowledge of those who served beyond a name is fading away, lost to time and history. The research of wartime heritage has identified some 1,578 men and women that served between 1914 and 1918 with connection to the town of Yarmouth, the villages, and the communities of the county. 274 men and women were born or living within the geographical area of the Wedgeport Legion. 31, including the 6 casualties listed on the Carleton Memorial, would not return to their families. In 1914, 53% of the Canadian population was under the age of 25. Our communities were rural, fishing and farming, our major industries. There were no telephones, very few in the rural areas. Communication was slow, and news of world events would be found in newspapers many weeks after they happened. From our area, many went to the United States to find work. 132 from the area of this legion are listed among 722 men that we can identify, born in the town and the county, who registered in the United States for the United States draft in 1917. From this legion area, many served in the trenches of France and Belgium. Others served with the Railway Construction Battalion and the Canadian Forestry Corps. Some served only in Canada. One, Benny Muse of Spring Haven, served in the British West Indies. 4 served with the Siberian Expeditionary Force. Lindsay Woodrow of Little River Harbor, John Woodrow of Melbourne, Henry Surratt and Melbourne Burke of Eelbrook. 3 served in the U.S. Army, including Elmer Lloyd Smith, born in Little River Harbor, Ellie Joseph Malazon and Ernest Burke from Wedgeport. 2 served as nurses. Annie Maud Killam, with connection to Tuscott, served in the U.S. Army Nurse Corps. From our area of Nova Scotia, some 90 were between the ages of 14 and 17 at enlistment. 17 were from the geographical area of this legion. When Britain declared war on August the 4th of 1914, Canada was also at war. It was in Bremen, Germany, that the first consequence of the declaration of war would connect to our small part of the world. George Purdy of Plymouth was a merchant seaman, master of the SS Pandosia, registered out of St. John, New Brunswick. The ship was seized on August the 4th, 1914 by German authorities, and Captain Purdy, aged 48, was taken as a civilian prisoner of war. In 1918, the ship was returned to its owners and Captain Purdy returned home. He died in 1923, aged 57, and is buried in the Plymouth Cemetery. While one nation after another became involved and the armies began to clash across the globe, in our part of Nova Scotia, the first enlistments were very slow. Some 50 miles off the coast of Chile, an 18-year-old Malcolm Cann of Yarmouth would be one of the first 4 Canadians killed in the war when HMS Good Hope was sunk by a German destroyer on November the 1st of 1914. On November 7th, the Yarmouth Light published a war extra listing the death of Midshipman Cann. The news galvanized our area into wartime activity. In the weeks following, some 50 enlisted, including Manning Muse, born in Surratt's Island, George Nickel, born in Pleasant Lake, Edward Hubbard of Tuscott, and William Nadeau, born in Wedgeport. They enlisted with the 25th Battalion, a shoemaker, a clerk, a fisherman, and a cook. Manning enlisted at 28. He was a sergeant, served in France. He survived the enemy bullets and the shells, but he was bitten by an enemy dog in 1918, serious enough that he would have to be hospitalized. George was 19 at enlistment. He served in France. He suffered a gunshot wound in 1916, and when his wounds healed, he went back into the trenches in France. Edward was 18. He served in France. He returned home and would die in 1922 from tuberculosis, his death attributed to his war service. William was 41 at enlistment. He served in France. He became ill and was hospitalized with pleurisy. René Doucet and Walter Pache from Wedgeport both enlisted on September the 3rd of 1915. They were both fishermen and 18 years old. Their birthdays were one day apart. René served with the 25th Battalion in France. Walter served with the 26th Battalion. René was killed in action in 1916. He has no grave. His name is listed on the Vimy Memorial in France. Walter died in August of 1916, killed in action in the trenches southwest of St. Eloi. He is buried in the Ridgewood Military Cemetery in Belgium. Frank Gus Hubbard from Tuscott enlisted at 15 with the 112th Battalion in March of 1916. He claimed he was 18. He served with the Royal Canadian Regiment in France and was gassed in August of 1917 and hospitalized for 6 months. 3 months later, after returning to France, his actual age was discovered by the military, and he was transferred to England as a minor and posted to the Young Soldiers Battalion. Frank Muse was from Quinnen. He was 16 when he enlisted. While in England, he contracted mumps, and the military discovered his actual age. He served in England, not permitted to fight in the trenches of France, and he was discharged on demobilization in 1919. Bernard Jerome Cutreau from Wedgeport was 16 when he enlisted. He served in France with the Canadian Forestry Corps. Because he was not injured or hospitalized, his true age was never discovered. On discharge in 1919, he was 19 years of age. George Warren Hatfield was born in Tuscott. He enlisted at 17. While moving forward to reinforce the front lines during an enemy counterattack on August the 26th of 1918, he was struck in the head and instantly killed by a bullet from an enemy sniper's rifle. On March 10th of 1916, a recruiting meeting was held in Kempville. Truman Moore Allen was born in Forest Glen, aged 18. He was the eldest of 9 children. Worked on a farm, and for a time he worked with Graham and Nickel, who operated a lumber business in Carleton. He attended that meeting and found himself caught up in the patriotic furor of the time. 2 days later, he enlisted and served with the 85th Battalion in France. He suffered a gunshot wound to the face while on a salvage party, was evacuated to a field ambulance station where he died from his wounds. Initial military records indicate that the reported location of his grave was in the Domart Military Cemetery. However, no known grave exists, and his name is listed only on the Vimy Memorial, one of the many mysteries of World War I. For some 50 years, a faded postcard of Truman in his uniform hung on the wall in the home of a childhood friend, until after her death in 1966, a reminder of the young man who had been a neighbor so many, many years before. Simon Doucet of Tusket enlisted after the recruiting rally in the Tusket courthouse on March the 18th of 1916. Simon served with the 85th Battalion in France and was killed in action at Passchendaele. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, his mother placed flowers at the base of the Tusket Memorial at the service held on the third Sunday of August each year. The schoolmaster at Tusket, himself a wounded veteran, Thomas Mack, at those same services would lay flowers in memory of George Hatfield, who no longer had relatives living in the area. As the war continued through 1917 and 18, enlistments from our area increased. The 165th French Acadian Battalion was based in Moncton, New Brunswick, and they began recruiting in late 1915 throughout the Maritime provinces. The battalion embarked Canada at Halifax on March the 25th, 1917, and disembarked in England at Liverpool on April 4th. In England, the battalion was absorbed into the 13th Reserve Battalion. While many hoped that they would serve in the regular battle battalions, such was not to be the case. The soldiers from Yarmouth County were transferred to various companies of the Canadian Forestry Corps and served throughout England and France. Somewhat unique is the story of Albert Pache of Wedgeport and his three sons, Luke, aged 28, Charles, aged 26, and Cyril, aged 19. Albert enlisted at the age of 53, although he claimed he was 45. He had represented Yarmouth County in the Nova Scotia House of Assembly from 1894 to 1897. He enlisted in the 165th Battalion in June of 1916 and served with the Canadian Forestry Corps in England. The three boys would also join the 165th Battalion. Cyril was the first to enlist in April of 1916, Luke and Charles in May of the same year. Luke and Charles each served in France with the Canadian Forestry Corps. Cyril, however, was transferred to the 22nd Battalion. He was wounded in action in June of 1918, suffering gunshot wounds to the leg, the left arm, and back. He was admitted to hospital in France and transferred to England. He returned to Canada and was admitted to Camp Hill Hospital in December of 1918 and released and discharged in April of 1919, aged 22. Adrian, Bernard, and Mark Cuttrow, three brothers, the son of Mary Cuttrow from Wedgeport, also served. Bernard, known as Bernie, was 16 years old. He was 5 foot, 1 inch in height, and he was the first of the brothers to enlist. And he served as a bugler in the 165th Battalion. Zachary Muse was the fourth of 13 children, the son of Thomas and Jane Muse of Quinnan. Being only 5 feet in height, he was known in the community as the Petit Carry and called by the name Carry. His official military attestation paper records his name as Harry. Being unable to read or write, like so many of the World War I recruits, one can just imagine him on November the 3rd of 1916 standing before the recruiting officer who would have completed the attestation form. Asked his name, Zachary would say his name was Carey. After all, that was how he was known. The recruiting officer wrote Harry, and so Zachary became Harry Muse. Harry signed his attestation paper with his mark, an X. On November the 11th, 1917, he crossed to France for service with the 85th Battalion. 10 months later, while in the field near Arras, he was severely wounded when struck by shrapnel to the right shoulder and the right forearm, his right leg, arm, and face, losing his sight in his left eye. He was first taken to a field ambulance station and then evacuated to a military hospital in England, where he remained until April of 1919. He was returned to Canada for continued medical treatment at Camp Hill. On July 24th, 1919, having served in Canada, England, and France, He was medically discharged age 24 at Halifax. While his wounds healed, he had various body scars, partial loss of function to his right hand, and the loss of his left eye. He returned to Quinnen, where he continued to farm. He never married. On September the 30th of 1934, at the age of 37, he died of tuberculosis. He was buried in the Roman Catholic Cemetery in Quinnen. His grave has no marker, but today we remember him. His picture is in the showcase. John Walter Doucette was also from Quinnen. He served with the 13th Battalion and was twice wounded in action. Hospitalized in Birmingham, England, he met, fell in love, and obtained permission to marry Gladys Godfrey in England. At the end of the war, she joined him in Canada, a World War I war bride. However, after several months, they returned to England. Some who served in World War I also served in World War II. John Wallace, Benny Muse of Springhaven, Frank Alec Cuttrow of Wedgeport, John Freeman Fitzgerald of Camoes Hill, Lewis Morris of Springhaven, and Joseph Edmund Doucette, who served in the Merchant Navy in World War II and was killed when his ship, the SS Maplecourt, was torpedoed by a German U-boat on February the 6th of 1941. There are so many stories that could be told of prisoners of war, of nursing sisters, the 18 that died and others wounded in the Vimy Ridge battles, or of Clarence Scholes, who enlisted at Yarmouth in 1916 and died of wounds on November the 11th, 1918, at 5:30 a.m., 30 minutes after the official signing of the armistice. In our modern world, it is perhaps difficult to imagine the tragedy of World War I, the conditions and the horror of trench warfare, the maimed, the injured among those who returned, and the loss of those who did not, of officers ordering men into no man's land to face the onslaught of gas and bullets and artillery from the enemy, or of how thousands could be wounded or killed in less than an hour along the Western Front. And on the home front, the worry of parents, of small children missing their older brothers, of mothers, fathers, and wives awaiting news from overseas. Edwin Willard was 23 when he enlisted. After the battle at Passchendaele on October the 30th of 1917, his wife Elsie received word that he was missing in action. She lived in hope, but heard nothing further, until a letter arrived dated March 27, 1918, written in a dugout in a trench in France by a private Mills who was a stretcher bearer, and it read in part, "I was going to wait until we got out of the line, but we never know when that will be. So I will try and tell you what little I know about your husband. He was a man we all knew and all liked. Well do I remember the morning of the 30th of October, and never will I forget it as long as I live. At 9:40, our big gun spoke, and we were away in that hell of bursting shells and flying shrapnel. We were only able to advance a few hundred yards. I saw your husband lying in a shell hole, and when he saw me, he waved his hand for me to hurry up and come to him. But I had a good many cases to look after before I could get to where he was. When I finally got there, I found him lying in the side of a shell hole in water up to his knees and helpless. The first thing I did was to get him out of the hole with the help of a German Red Cross prisoner, who, by the way, helped me to dress his wounds and stayed with me for over a half hour. I found that he was wounded in two places, in the left leg close up to the body and in the back. That one was the worst, if not fatal. It took us some time, but your husband took it all fine. The only thing he said was, 'I am all in.' I told him not to worry, and he would make Blighty all right. After dressing his wounds, I covered him up with his greatcoat and told him that the stretcher parties would soon pick him up. I had lots of work to do, so I had to leave him, and that was the last I saw of him. It was some time before our stretcher bearers were able to get to that hillside to pick up the wounded, and in that time, the German artillery had got busy and were pounding that side of the hill all to pieces. I really think that hill or ridge changed its face of nature about 10 times in the next 24 hours. And should your husband have lived, I am afraid that another shell would have finished its deadly work. I think we will have to resign ourselves to the fact that your husband has gone to a far better front where all is peace and quiet. Today, 100 years after the end of World War I, we remember, for none of these men and women who served should ever be forgotten. Thank you for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share with you but a few of the many stories that could be told of those who served in the service of Canada from this Legion area. Thank you very much.